Hello everyone, Professor T here. In this mini lecture, I'm going to help you to understand the brain mechanisms underlying reward, as well as their relationships to drugs of addiction. Let's begin with a question. How many times will a rat press a lever for pleasure? This is not a trivial question, and the answer is a lot, many times, specifically about 2,000 times per hour, which is equivalent to every other second. But I'll explain more in a little bit. Today's topics, therefore, are reward and addiction, and within that we're going to understand the role that the neurotransmitter dopamine plays in reward and addiction. We're then going to understand psychoactive drugs and the different classes of them, as well as their effects on the central and peripheral nervous system, short and long-term effects, as well as any clinical uses that these drugs may have. In 1954, a classic experiment was conducted by Olds and Milner. Here, they implanted electrodes in the brains of rats in specific brain areas in a procedure that we call intracranial self-stimulation. Essentially, they placed rats in a Skinner box and allowed self-stimulation through electricity of these particular brain areas to observe their self-stimulation pattern. So rats were able to press a lever to get a pleasant shock delivered to these brain areas. Hence, their continuous pressing of the lever in the answer to that question that I began with. Rats press the lever every other second to release dopamine in an area called the nucleus accumbens. This is an area that is part of the ventral striatum, and it is also part of a specific dopamine pathway, which I'm illustrating here in green. There are three main dopamine pathways that originate in the midbrain and the ventral tegmental area. And the one that we're concerned with that underlies reward is this mesolimbic dopamine pathway originating in the VTA and ending in this area that subserves the feeling of pleasure that we call the nucleus accumbens. So rats that had electrodes implanted in this brain area were continuously pressing the lever for that pleasurable shock. In other brain areas, not as much. This then underscored the neural substrate of pleasure and motivated behaviors. And this does not only apply to this pleasurable shock or drugs of abuse, it also applies to anything that releases the neurotransmitter dopamine in this mesolimbic pathway, namely other substances and behaviors, including sex, gambling, video game playing, pornography, and even food. Okay, so why do people get addicted? This is the million-dollar question, right? If we could only find out the reason, then maybe we could better address this huge personal and societal problem that comes at an exorbitant cost. There are various factors that contribute to continued substance abuse. As you guys know, it is not a simple answer. There's not a simple answer. So there are several theories. One of the theories is what we call this positive incentive theory. What does this mean? This theory emphasizes the pleasurable effects of the drug. So the pleasure is the incentive. Here, people take the drug because it stimulates precisely that mesolimbic dopamine pathway that ends in the nucleus accumbens and therefore works by positive reinforcement. The more you take the drug, the more as you take the drug, it feels pleasurable, it feels good, and therefore you get reinforced and you keep doing it. This is all good and well. It does explain the onset of drug use because it feels good, right? But not its perpetuation, because we know that as tolerance develops, there's a discrepancy between the expected pleasant or pleasurable effects of the drug and the actual amount of pleasure that is experienced, right? As we know, tolerance refers to the diminished psychoactive effects after repeated use. Therefore, you need to increase the dose to get the same effect, right? So people addicted to drugs are highly motivated to get them even if they no longer provide the same pleasurable effects. Why? So there's another theory, this physical dependence or psychological dependence theory, which emphasizes not the pleasurable effects, but the avoidance of withdrawal. Here, it suggests that as people become dependent on a drug and tolerant, they need to take the drug to function normally, right? They are dependent on it, and therefore they're trying to avoid withdrawal symptoms, which can be very painful, as we know, when you're not taking the drug. So for example, when you are dependent on alcohol and you go into withdrawal, you may feel very anxious, you may feel the jitters, nausea, sweating, or even the DTs, or delirious tremens, or delirium tremens, which is a life-threatening condition that consists of high blood pressure, tremors, and even seizures. So according to this theory, this physical and psychological dependence theory, drug addiction works by negative reinforcement, which means that you are taking the drug to avoid a negative consequence or an unpleasant feeling. So this theory explains how addiction is perpetuated, but not necessarily its onset, right? Because you're not dependent on a drug when you first started. But together with positive incentive, they're starting to cover more ground as to why people get addicted. Finally, I have this last kind of a hodgepodge miscellaneous category of brain reorganization and genetics to explain drug addiction. And here the focus is on structural and functional changes that we see in the brain as people get addicted, as well as genetic predisposition, which, as we know, is a very important factor. So on the one hand, as people get addicted, there's a decreased sensitivity in reward circuits in the brain. That is, the high is blunted, right? You become less sensitive to the drug. On the other hand, there's an enhanced sensitivity of memory circuits that are associated with conditioned drug expectations and cues. For example, like people and places that are associated with the drug. Maybe these are your buddies that you normally do the drug with, or a particular place like the basement in your home, or a nightclub, or when you see a syringe or a pipe. These are all cues that become ingrained in your memory and therefore condition you to want the drug. So those become strengthened while there's less sensitivity to reward, to pleasure. There's also weakened control, right? This is a change in the brain that we observe. There are weakened control circuits, and therefore you are more prone to continue using the drug despite your will, and you're more likely to relapse, especially in the face of stressful events, drug priming, meaning a single exposure to a drug that you've been having, and also to these cues, right? People, places, and objects. So those are the brain reorganization, that's the brain reorganization that we see. But there's also the genetic predisposition aspect, right? And we know that here there are multiple genes that impact your predisposition to becoming more addicted. That's some people who may not have those versions of those genes, those specific alleles, right? And so it is a polygenic problem. And there are several genes that are implicated. For example, there's the long dopamine 4 receptor gene. This is a specific type of receptor for the dopamine neurotransmitter that seems to be less sensitive to dopamine, and therefore people with this allele become they have more cravings, they have higher tolerance because they're less sensitive to the effects of dopamine. So that's one gene that may predispose you to addiction. Another one is the COMT gene, COMT, which stands for catechol methyltransferase, COMT, which is an enzyme that breaks down dopamine. Here, in these people who have this allele, COMT is more active, which means that it breaks down dopamine faster, which means that you need more to feel the same pleasurable effects that other people may feel with less dopamine. So there are other genes that may influence your propensity to be addicted, including risk-taking and stress response genes as well. But together, these three theories start to give us an idea of why people become addicted. Next up, we're going to learn about different types of psychoactive drugs, different classes and specific exemplars within those classes of drugs. When we talk about psychoactive drugs, we're talking about consciousness-altering drugs, right? When somebody is under the effect of a drug, that means that something about the way that they process information, that they experience the world, that they feel, that they behave is altered. This happens all at the synapse, as we have learned. Psychoactive drugs act at the synapse by either stimulating them, blocking or inhibiting them, and or mimicking the effects of specific neurotransmitters. So they all act at the synapse. What changes are observed when you take a drug? Just think about somebody who's under the influence, or maybe if you have been yourself. There are physical effects, right? For example, you may notice somebody's eyes are changed. They're either red or glassy or droopy, or the pupils are really big or tiny, tiny pinprick pupils. So those are some physical effects, but you can also, and most importantly here for us in this course, notice changes in moods, perceptions, emotions, thoughts, and of course behavior. Somebody may feel more agitated or slower, paranoid, or suddenly enlightened, as some of us may like to think. So those are some of the effects of psychoactive drugs. But what are we talking about when we're talking about classes of psychoactive drugs? Well, we have what we call stimulants in the field. These are what in street lingo you may call uppers, right? They may make you feel more alert, more energized, as opposed to, and sorry, these are some of the examples of stimulants, like when you have nicotine, you smoke cigarettes, for example, or vape. When you drink coffee or have some types of tea that have caffeine. When you do coke or meth or amphetamines. These are all uppers or stimulants. They stimulate the nervous system. On the other hand, we have what we call depressants. These don't mean that they make you sad or blue, as in a depressive state, but really they are downers. They make you feel slowed down, less alert, less active, right? They depress your central nervous system. Examples include alcohol, opiates, benzos, barbiturates, etc. We have another category, which is that of hallucinogens, or what people generally will call psychedelics. These tend to alter your perception, either visually or emotionally or auditorily. They may give you hallucinations. They may change your mood in specific ways as well, that aren't necessarily just more active or more depressed, but they may grant you access to what people would call in the 60s the doors of perception, right? They may open up the doors of perception. These include, of course, LSD, or commonly referred to as acid, psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, mescaline and peyote, MDMA and ecstasy, DMT, etc. These are all examples of hallucinogens or psychedelics. Finally, we have good old weed or pot, marijuana, right? And its active ingredient THC, which is in its own category because it doesn't really belong in any of the others. So how do these drugs produce their effects? How do they act on the nervous system to produce that high? Well, let's start with the stimulant category. Stimulants are generally monoamine agonists, meaning that they increase the effects of monoamines such as dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline and noradrenaline. How do they do this? For example, take cocaine. Cocaine blocks the dopamine transporter protein, and therefore its reuptake back into the synaptic vesicle that released it, therefore leaving more dopamine in the synapse to be taken up by the postsynaptic neuron, and therefore increasing the effects of dopamine. So that's cocaine. Amphetamines also block dopamine reuptake, and additionally, they bind to MAO, or the monoamine oxidase enzyme, which is one that should break down dopamine. But in this case, amphetamine inhibits MAO, therefore leaving more dopamine available in the synapse, again, to exert its effect on the postsynaptic neuron. Methylphenidate or Ritalin acts in a similar fashion by blocking dopamine, or the dopamine, blocking the reuptake of dopamine through its transporter, but it does so in a more gradual and controlled fashion. As we've seen, stimulants generally increase sympathetic function, so high blood pressure, high heart rate. That's how you observe that agitation in somebody who's had amphetamines or coke. They're not down, they're not slow, they're fast, right? And it increases arousal and alertness. How about depressants, the next class of drugs? Take alcohol, for example. Alcohol is both a GABA and a dopamine agonist. That means that it increases the effects of both GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter in the nervous system, and dopamine. But it also is a glutamate antagonist, and glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, right? So if it is an antagonist, that means that it decreases the effect of glutamate and increases the effect of GABA. That means that you're going to have a general slowdown of the nervous system, even though alcohol works in a biphasic action. If you've had 2 or 3 drinks, it may seem like it's a stimulant, but after that, it's all downhill in the sense that you just become slower and slower. It tends to lower your anxiety, but also your restraint and your inhibitions, right? Making you more aggressive and impairing, of course, your judgment and decision making and motor coordination, which is, of course, the perfect storm for, say, a car crash or a driving accident, right? Under depressants, we also have opiates, which are the natural substances found in the poppy seed, right? Like opium and morphine, as well as its synthetic counterparts, which we call opioids, like heroin, Oxycontin, Percocet, methadone, fentanyl, etc. These are indirect dopamine agonists. Again, we're going to see this running thread of dopamine agonism, right? Because all pleasurable drugs exert their effects in that mesolimbic dopamine pathway that releases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. So opiates and opioids are no exception. That is how they cause that euphoric feeling, that blissful feeling once you are under that kind of high. And they're also endorphin agonists, which is how they produce their analgesia or pain relief, right? So those are some examples of depressants: alcohol, opiates, and opioids. The next class of drugs that we have are the hallucinogens or psychedelics. These generally also are dopamine agonists to some extent, especially, say, MDMA, but mostly they are serotonin agonists. That's what distinguishes them a little bit from the other classes of drugs. They tend to exert their action by binding to serotonin and therefore producing not only these feel-good effects, but also some of the more hallucinogenic effects of time expansion, visual hallucinations, ego dissolution, where you feel like you're not so self-centered, you're more open to and more connected to other people, which is very useful in therapy, actually, as we will see. Finally, we have marijuana, which is, marijuana or the cannabis plant contains more than 80 cannabinoids, most of which are not psychoactive, right? But THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the active ingredient in marijuana. CBD, or cannabidiol, was thought to be non-psychoactive, but new data shows that it can actually modulate the effect of THC on CB1 receptors. So cannabis has a couple of different types of receptors throughout our bodies, not just in our brains and central nervous system, but also throughout the immune system, the digestive tract, even the skin, right? But CB1 receptors are mostly concentrated on the hippocampus and cerebellum, which serve memory and motor functions, right? And then CB2 receptors are mostly in the periphery, in the peripheral nervous system, including, say, the immune system. And that is how, say, CBD oil, which again binds mostly to the CB2 receptors, can be good for several things that, and not be as psychoactive like THC that binds to CB1 receptors. So these are also dopamine agonists again, right? And they are glutamate and GABA antagonists. An interesting thing about THC is that it binds to receptors that exist in our bodies for substances that are very similar to it, which we call endocannabinoids, right? Endocannabinoids are our own body's THC, if you will. These are substances that are naturally occurring, like anandamide and 2-AG. They are neurotransmitters that have receptors throughout our bodies to which THC binds or hijacks, if you will. The effects on the nervous system are well known, the effects of marijuana, including relaxation or stress relief, sensory vividness, increased appetite or the munchies, and altered cognition, right? An altered thought process, like your attention, your perception, your memory, your reasoning, which is not a good recipe for school, right? You're kind of slower in information processing. So those are the nervous system actions. How about their effects both in the short term and in the long run for these types of drugs? Well, starting with stimulants, depending on which one you do, of course, but generally you can observe reduced appetite and therefore weight loss. You can have various negative cardiovascular effects, including cardiovascular failure, such as a heart attack, for example, psychosis, paranoia, and even seizures. At very high doses, of course, you can have overdoses and fatal overdoses at that, right? People have died, say, of cardiac arrest from doing too many amphetamines, for example. As far as depressants and their short and long-term effects, again, depending on what you do, which substance you do, alcohol, for example, can cause severe withdrawal, right? You can have headaches, nausea, vomiting, tremors, abdominal cramps, sweating, and the DTs, as we mentioned earlier, delirium tremens. You can also have more long-term consequences like Korsakoff syndrome. This is a neurological condition that results from vitamin B1 thiamine deficiency, which is related to alcohol consumption. In Korsakoff syndrome, people become very confused and they start to forget as well as confabulate or make up stuff. You can also have cirrhosis, of course, which is liver scarring from too much alcohol consumption. Pregnant women can have fetal alcohol syndrome, or their children can. And excessive alcohol use can cause at least dendritic loss and potentially cell loss or neuron death. Opiates, of course, can cause very severe withdrawal symptoms as well. They're also depressants, which include insomnia, muscle spasms, diarrhea, vomiting, and of course, you can have a fatal overdose by respiratory depression, right? You can just stop breathing and die from opiate overdose. Hallucinogens are generally don't cause overdoses nearly as easily, and definitely usually not through respiratory depression like depressants do. They generally can cause dehydration or hyperthermia, so high body temperatures. They can cause psychosis when people just can't handle all of the different sensory changes and mental changes that they're experiencing. You can have depression if you do a lot of these and then say the next day you're just depleted from dopamine because you used up so much of it and just crash and have those Monday and Tuesday blues after you've done these drugs all weekend. That also applies to stimulants. But also hallucinogens such as LSD and ecstasy can cause severe memory and learning impairments. So that's something to watch out for there. Finally, marijuana and THC, as we know, can cause memory and motor impairment, as well as some anxiety and paranoia in some people. These are usually in the short run, though. They don't tend to last after you stop doing the drug. Finally, are there any uses to these drugs? The answer is yes, to many of them, even though the politics behind it is very complicated and illogical with the whole schedule of drugs, right? Schedule 1, Schedule 2, marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, even though it has many, many, many clinical uses. Being a Schedule 1 drug would indicate otherwise, right? So there are clinical uses despite some of these drugs' uses sometimes not being recognized legally. So what are they good for? Stimulants can be used as local anesthetics, such as the case of cocaine, for example. You may be surprised to hear that you can use it in your mouth, gums, nose, throat as a local anesthetic. Other stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall are, of course, used to treat ADHD and narcolepsy, so sleepiness disorder. Some depressants, like opiates, obviously are used for pain relief. So they're painkillers. Hallucinogens are increasingly being studied and used in therapy. So, for example, MDMA is being used in therapy for PTSD very successfully. Magic mushrooms or psilocybin is being used to treat anxiety. For example, in people who have cancer and are afraid to die, they can benefit from this. And there's a lot of new research into ketamine for, say, anxiety and depression. So hallucinogens are definitely up and coming in the therapeutic sphere. Finally, many of you may know that marijuana has multiple clinical uses, including pain relief, treatment of insomnia, of nausea and vomiting. It increases appetite or appetite stimulation. It can be used to treat glaucoma and even epilepsy. So, that is what we have for this mini lecture, at the end of which you should be able to explain reward and addiction and identify their biological substrates, right? So the brain mechanisms behind them. And you should be able to compare and contrast the action of different drugs at the synaptic level, as well as explain their psychological effects. That's it, everybody. I'll catch you on the next mini lecture. Take care.